On this episode, we'll react to some recent comments by JP Morgan CEO Jamie Dimon about the looming national debt crisis and whether the rich need to pay more taxes. And later on, we're going to weigh in on what some have said is a recent uptick in people in right-wing circles trying to mainstream race pseudoscience. Hello, welcome to the Call I See It podcast. I'm James Keys, and the man you see pulling up here with me is someone who rejects your assumptions because he refuses to let you make a you-know-what out of you-know-who. Tunde Ogunlana. Tunde, are you ready to hit him over the head with some facts today?
Yeah, you made me think a lot there in that intro, so but I figured it out. I won't say it, though. So
a lot of moving parts, man. A lot of moving parts.
Yeah, exactly. I had my coffee this morning, so we're ready.
There you go. So, all right. Now, we're recording this on August 27th, 2024. And a few weeks back, we took note of some comments by JP Morgan Chase CEO Jamie Dimon about the unsustainable nature of government spending in the U.S. right now and the increasing need to address this. Now, when talking about debt, many contend that the raw number is less important than the ratio of debt to GDP. But as Dimon noted, that ratio is going out of whack too. And Jamie Dimon is a serious guy. When people, when he talks economic stuff, he will pay attention. And he asserts to address this, we're not only going to need to look at strategies to continue to increase growth, but also look to raise taxes to increase the revenue coming into the government that it's going to spend. But before we get into kind of the tax part, we do want to discuss the debt itself, because just looking at the numbers, it is staggering. So Tunde, to get us started, what are your thoughts on Dimon raising the alarm on the national debt and, really this explosion we've seen over the past couple of decades where we've gone from like less than $1 trillion in national debt in 1980 to a little under $6 trillion in 2000 to over $35 trillion today? Yeah,
no, it's a great lead up to this conversation, the way you opened up, because I think it says something when Jamie Dimon, someone like him at his stature within the financial industry, both banking and Wall Street, just makes a statement and kind of puts his thumb on the scale in terms of the conversation about where we are in terms of the kind of the debt and the deficit, but also how to deal with it. Because the idea of the concept of supply side economics is very unfriendly to the idea of trying to raise government revenue through the tax code, and so I think for our lifetime, the better part of our lifetime since 1980, there's been a culture in especially the financial industry and the financial world to shy away from ever talking about things like raising taxes. And I think the fact that
Grover Norquists of the world and so forth, where it's that's completely off the table from jump. Yeah.
There's entire economic ecosystems of think tanks and others that have developed over the last 40 years, basically to hold that dam so it doesn't break, of people that just are antithetical to any type of increase in taxes. And so the reason why
just real quick on that, I'm sorry. What that always raises the question to me on whether or not the idea of supply side economics was actually a coherent theory or the rationalization that they came up with in order to, as a part of the idea of holding the dam on not ever raising taxes. But no, go ahead.
No, I think that's a good point, which I think we definitely should come back to. I'll finish this, and I actually want to come back to that. Is the reason why Jamie Dimon's important is because he is the only CEO of a major bank that is still in his role since the 2008 financial crisis. And he was seen as one of the best people in the banking sector one of the people who best navigated that very difficult time for our economy and the financial system. So he's got a lot of respect.
He was best prepared beforehand and navigated it well also, both. Yeah. Like he wasn't overextended like so many others were and so forth. But no, that's right.
And also has done a great job with managing JP Morgan ever since. So that's what I mean. When someone like him speaks, it's like, wow, okay, if he's saying that, we must be in an interesting place. Let's put it that way. And I think going back to the point you made, which I wanted to come back to is, yeah, it's interesting because in preparing for today, I did a lot of reading about Reaganomics and kind of that era. And what I think, in fairness to people coming up with those ideas, because I think you're right. I think there was a lot of it was window dressing, and I think there were some people that knew that. And I think there are some people, like anything else, that genuinely believe that this could have been something to bring the country into a better place. Because if you think about the 70s, you did have a genuine recession. You had the oil crisis. You had high unemployment, high inflation going into the late 70s. So by 1980 through 81, 82, one could appreciate that there would be arguments about, hey, let's do something different. And I think where I'm at now is like, okay, so we tried Reaganomics and we see that there's a lot of problems that created, maybe intentionally, maybe unintentionally, right? But we're here now 45 years later or so, 2 generations later, and we can see issues with the national debt, with outsourcing of jobs overseas, deregulation of the financial industry for 24 years straight, or 28 years. I was thinking between 2000 and 2008. Reagan, Bush 1, Clinton, Bush 2, all had the same kind of mindset of just total deregulatory for the financial system, and has left us where we are in certain respects. So
we had a big crisis as well with the financial crisis.
And so I just think, it's.
Well, let me jump in because I wanted to get some initial thoughts in before we get too far down the road.
No, go ahead.
No, I mean, I think Dimon raising it, as I would piggyback on what you said as far as this is a serious guy. When he speaks, he knows his voice carries a lot of weight as well. And so for him to do this, what it means is that we need to start having this conversation because, again, you see the numbers and they're like video game numbers in the sense of how can you go from less than $1 trillion, in debt, and that that was that way for a long time. And then you go from that in 1980 to over 35 trillion, 44 years later. That means something's wrong. I mean, that is, and again, oh yes, the GDP has gone up. So the ratio, and all that kind of stuff. But no, I mean, that's, we're doing something wrong structurally, systemically, we're doing something wrong. If in order for our economy to function and our government to function under the current kind of thought process, we need to borrow that much money. That just, there needs to be some kind of reimagining. And yeah, I mean, you talked about how, with the kind of the supply side approach, I would say that many people knew in advance that this would not work out, because the idea of the Reaganomics and was that, and this, the supply side, so to speak, to try to put it in economic terms, I'll put it in terms more, what I think are more apt, actually quoting Reagan's vice president, George H.W. Bush, voodoo economics. But basically, you cut taxes on the wealthy, and then that creates so much growth that actually you will increase tax receipts because there's so much more economic activity because of these cut taxes that you'll actually, the government will pull in more money from taxes, even though it cut the rate. It never worked, and it never has worked. It was just one of those things somebody dreamed up and was able to sell it, and then obviously it's not a hard sell, cutting taxes, so to speak, but ultimately it's not something that has proven to be sustainable absent the borrowing money, and it wasn't right away. I mean, Ronald Reagan borrowed more money than any president before him, outside of wartime. Basically, you look at Woodrow Wilson, World War I, FDR, World War II, and then you got Reagan, and it's like, well, hold up, man, we weren't in a world war. How are you borrowing all this money? And so it ends up in the situation where, okay, we started down this track. What is doing this track, though, it's really hard to get off of, because when you come into leadership, it's basically the promise of free money. The free money, that your kids are going to have to pay for, your grandkids are going to have to pay for, but you don't have to pay for it. You don't have to raise taxes in order to spend for this and spend for that. And it's gotten to the point where, both parties are all in on increasing the debt for different reasons, and I'm going to kick it back to you right here. But, whereas Donald Trump, raised the debt more than anybody had in 4 years, in a 4-year span, maybe somebody had borrowed more over 8 years, but over 4 years, nobody borrowed more than Donald Trump. He didn't, he had some spending, but a lot of that was due to the the tax cuts. So we're already running a deficit, and he gets in and says, "Hey, let's cut some taxes some more." So and then like when Obama comes in. Now, granted, Obama comes in and there's a crisis, but he has to see spending to get us out of a crisis, or the COVID crisis and things like that. So we end up in this situation where both of our two major parties, neither one. They may talk about it, but neither one is really saying, "Hey, we got to get this under control." Which I think, again, bringing it back, that's the key point on why someone serious from Wall Street, from banking, is like, "Hey, guys, we need to be looking at this. We need serious people to look at this." Now, that's another question, whether we got serious people that are enough serious people in power.
Yeah, well, that's a whole different conversation.
Yeah, that's a whole other question.
That's a conversation about politics, not economics.
Yeah,
but
correct.
But I want to just follow up before we move to kind of other discussions in this economic stuff. But really on the debt, because you're right. I think the debt is something that us as Americans, we don't. It's complex and it's something that's not easily understood. I mean, it's easy to understand. Okay, you owe money, right? And the debt, kind of at a top level.
Yeah, but you're borrowing money to pay your bills. So
yeah, that's easy. But to kind of, like you're saying, about going in the nuances, where's the money being spent? What is the purpose of the borrowing? So on and so forth, gets a little more nuanced. And then you've got two big, if you can say that deficit spending in general is the big trunk of a tree. And then the first two major branches to go in different directions. One would be the budget deficit based on revenue and expenses on an annual basis of the U.S. government and the Treasury versus, let's say, the fiscal deficit, meaning all the money you owe to creditors over the long run. And that's that big 30.
I don't think we should overcomplicate it, though. I mean, we can stick with the debt here, less the deficit.
Well, here's why I just want to cover it, because just to explain what you mentioned of the 33 to 35 trillion that we currently owe out there. Because I'm going to go back to 1980, which was the election year when Ronald Reagan won, going into 81. The national debt at that time was $738 billion. Like you said, it was under $1 trillion. By the time he left office in 1988, going into 89, it was $2.1 trillion. Yeah. So it had almost tripled it. Yeah. And so then it became kind of runaway, because that's when it becomes, okay, do you raise taxes at that point to try and stem the blow? And of course, George H.W. Bush did raise taxes and was punished for that. And then Clinton came in and continued more of the kind of corporate supply side style of things. But what he did do was compromise with the Republican-led Congress in the late 90s to balance the budget by doing things like, making changes to welfare and other social programs. So
he also did raise taxes towards the beginning, and then he cut back on revenue. Like Clinton balanced the budget. Yeah, but go ahead. Yeah,
no, but so I just want to get to the end of his term where he had a $200 billion budget surplus. And I remember this because this is when I was getting old enough in my early 20s to be watching politics and all that. In the year 2000 election, when Bush and Gore, there was a fight, right? Gore was saying, we need to continue to reinvest that money into the U.S. government and blah, 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 and into our country. And Bush said, no, we need to do a tax cut because this is your money. We got to give it back to the American people. So this is where, as you're saying, going into the early 2000s, Bush came in and cut taxes further and then did other things that I think escape our memory as a society because we get so much coming at us, like Medicare Part D in 2003, which put other trillions of dollars on debt on the books because it didn't allow
plus the war on terror.
Yeah, so I'm sorry. Yeah,
that was the future.
I think the estimate on the war on terror is $6 or $7 trillion.
Yeah,
in total spend.
Your point being that he did these big spends while cutting taxes, and so it was like, hey, let's lean into debt. Essentially, it was kind of a mindset that he embodied.
Sorry. No, I was just saying to your point, at the end of his term, we have a huge financial crisis. In 08, and by early 09, the other guy comes in, the next guy's got to spend another $1.5 trillion, $2 trillion just to plug that hole. So you're right. It's even with our quick rundown here, it's not difficult to see how the deficit was run up so high. And then you can see something. That's why I bring up Medicare Part D, because right now, it's taken 20 years, but we're at a point where the government can now negotiate again for the lowest prices with drug companies. So I think part of this is we as voters have elected people into office over the last two generations that have looked at the United States Treasury as a piñata for corporations in certain respects, and then also who have not worked on doing what Jamie Dimon's talking about is let's get creative and create a new way to raise revenue. Because the way we're doing it is not
creating a new way, though. It's it's not like innovative. It's things that have been done. And that's kind of if you go back prior to that, you look at the Keynesian approach where you have government spending and possibly even you use government spending when the private sector spending isn't sufficient to really continue growth. So if you're in a recession, that's when how you get out of the Great Depression, use government spending and so forth. But the point of that, or the key part about that will be once the private sector is rolling again, the government should pull back on that and raise the taxes again, so that can kind of reload, and so forth. And what's happened basically is that mindset, which did very well for us, getting us out of the Depression, taking us all the way to 1980, it did very well, but then that was kind of abandoned. At least the part of government pull back and increase the taxes to kind of reload the gun. What they realize is that, hey, we'll just keep borrowing. And instead of reloading the gun, the debt will be the gun. And so, and the question is, why does this matter? Debt service becomes a part of the budget. So a big part of this, other than obviously you would like your economic numbers to not appear as a third world country, which can affect you as far as your credit rating, which can affect you as far as just your standing internationally. As the debt, $35 trillion, you're paying interest on that each year. Debt service. That's going to become an increasingly large part of the budget every year. So, and actually, and this is something people do understand with credit card bills and everything like that. If your debt load is so high that your interest payments start just ballooning out of control, then it actually becomes something where it becomes very difficult for you to actually ever get out of the hole, because you're just in there just paying off the interest at that point. You can't even get to the principal. And so, yes, the point you made about where the direction it was taken versus Gore versus Bush, it's one of those things. It's a seminal moment, because it was like, okay, are we going to take this surplus that we have and reload the gun, invest in infrastructure to try to increase growth and, also pay down the debt some? Or are we going to take the surplus that we have and, blow it basically, and then a couple of years later actually start spending more money? Bush took the deficit, the debt from around 5 trillion where it was, in 2000 to around 10. He doubled it, in 08. So, it's kind of one of these things. It appears, the way it looks when you look at how, and we'll have some stuff in the show notes on this, it appears like the debt is almost like a drug to the politicians, though. Because it's like they really don't seem to be able to, it allows you to avoid making hard decisions or telling people to trying to sell delayed gratification. Like, hey, let's tighten our belts a little bit now and we'll have a better future. You don't have to say any of that kind of stuff. It's like you can have your cake, you can eat it too, everything like that. And so it kind of puts us in a bind, particularly when our politics are so defined by immediate gratification, and the person who promises you delayed gratification is not going to win the election. So it creates this difficult situation where how can you even get to someone with a mandate to get something under control that will hurt us in the future? Because it's like, well, the future, who cares about that a lot of times with our politics? So I want to ask you though,
well, let me jump on something you said real quick, because I think this is important. This is where the public gets frustrated over what you just said, which is that because it seems simple to us that how can you spend more money than you make, right? And then because we're all dealing as individuals and you've got this big system with all these moving parts. And I think that's where the frustration becomes that we have on our politicians. And the politicians are sitting in office knowing they can kick the can down the road, because they'll be out of office like Bush.
Not just kick the can down the road. You can just blame the other side. It becomes something you play politics with, and you don't have to take it seriously because you just convince.
So it's kind of like we're in a stalemate. That's all I wanted to. It's an interesting.
Well, and that's the reason. The big reason why we're in a stalemate with this is because part of the solution, most serious people would say, is the government has to increase revenue. And another word for that is increase taxes on people or on corporations or whatever, but increase taxes. And there aren't many people who get excited about that kind of message, or if somebody's selling that are really trying to buy it. But Dimon does, he very specifically has said, over the course of time, he's said that part of this needs to be, like the wealthy need to pay more taxes. And he's even invoking like the so-called Buffett rule, where, like people who make over $1 million shouldn't pay less as a percentage of their income than middle class people, which is very common under our current tax code with the way that you can kind of rig the system, so to speak, to your favor. Like not even illegally, but even legal. There are mechanisms where people who are millionaires pay less percentage tax than people who are just earning work people, working people. So what was what do you make of Dimon, even in going this direction as him, one of the wealthier people, out there, but saying, hey, the wealthy, you got to kick in more here.
Yeah.
For us to solve this, I should say. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm open to good creative ideas. Because I can see looking deeply into any of these and there's going to be some nuance, right? If you go, okay, well, anyone making over $1 million, there could be special circumstances. Someone make a large investment into businesses and hired a lot of people. Maybe they deserve to get some sort of relief from the tax code versus someone who just earned $5 million on a W-2. But people that earn money on W-2 generally don't get the benefit of loopholes and things like that. So,
if they have choices, they don't earn it on the W-2. But
yeah, exactly. But that's what I mean. But some people don't have a choice, right? If you're an executive at a large corporation or the GM of a professional sports team, you're earning a W-2, period. So and I know that those are very a small percentage of our population.
I was going to say, I think we should talk about the bigger point more than the rule more than the exceptions.
But I think, yes, the idea of not only just looking into new ideas, but I think just enforcing the existing, like the tax code itself at the 30,000 foot level, progressive tax system, until somebody figures out something better, has shown to be one of the more fair ways to deal with it, because there's been other ideas like the fair tax, which is a federal sales tax. There's the idea of right now, I think one of the ideas that is coming out of one of the campaigns is to abolish the IRS and just do it all with tariffs, raise revenue for the government like that. There's other ideas, but they seem kind of bulky and clunky, and that they may not be as smooth as something like a progressive tax system.
Or I think enforcement with the tariff system, the bigger problem with that, because Dimon talks about two things. You need policies that continue to promote growth, and you'll need policies that will enhance the tax collection, how much is being collected. The problem with the tariffs is that doesn't promote growth, you end up in a situation.
I agree.
But go ahead. I just wanted to add
promotes hostility. But think about it, because you make a good point that this is all done. You can't have this conversation in a vacuum from the reality of politics, because we're in a democracy. So the idea is that I think I saw stats that if the IRS was allowed to be funded the way that the Biden administration recently in the last 2 years wanted to, with the $80 billion and all that, they could have raised approximately an additional $400 billion a year, which is $4 trillion over 10 years.
Just enforcing the rules that are in place.
Enforcing existing rules. That's it.
Yeah.
So some of this, I think, is not about trying to invent new things. I think we got pretty good things on the books already. It's about now funding the IRS to the point where it can function properly and that we're not on hold for an hour every time we call. Also, maybe looking at some of the things that were created in the last 20 years, like carried interest for private equity funds, things like that, and maybe poking some holes in those. Yeah, I was just going to say, but I think the idea of a progressive tax system, I was surprised to see from 1980, the top rate was brought down first from 70 to 50%, but by 86, the top rate was already down to 28%. I forgot about that. So now we're at 37%. So I'm thinking, okay, 37 to 40. I don't want to kill people making a lot of money with that much more, because I just think if you enforce where we're at, you'll actually raise a lot more than we appreciate.
You're talking conceptually though, and so the problem that you have, and so I would say, we probably don't need to invent new solutions, because as we're talking about literally in this conversation, the tax code worked much better prior to 80, and I think Reagan's term is a seminal moment for this as well. Like as you just talked about, the changes, some of the significant changes that were made during the Reagan administration. It's not a coincidence that the debt was something rather static, for the 50 year or the 40 years leading up to 35 years leading up to Reagan's administration, and then it starts this upward mountain climb trajectory. And you talked about he's lowering these tax rates, he's cutting them in half. He cuts the tax rates in half for the top earners. Then since then, what you've done is, and this is what you alluded to also, is in addition to the overall rate getting cut down, now all these loopholes have been put in, to allow people to legally kind of, put their money in places and have the money come in ways that avoids the taxes. So it's one of those things where, yes, conceptually the ideas are there. I do think we probably need to look back to the past in terms of how the tax code was implemented, how it was structured, and how it was implemented, both how it was structured and how it was implemented, in terms of making sure that everybody pays their fair share. I mean, a progressive tax system is one that has been shown to work. And to me, that's the biggest thing that I think we have to lean in. And lean into. It's very difficult in this day and age because we live in a world now where people say things all the time and don't feel the need to back them up. Like we're going to get into that in our next section, where it's just like people just say things and the truth doesn't really matter. It's just, you'll just say it. If you can't prove it, oh, well, you'll just keep saying it over and over again. And that creates a difficulty, because what I'm saying is that, hey, let's look at what really did work, and then try to lean into some of those lessons that were learned there. And let's look at the things that didn't work in the last 45 years. And let's try to either use that as a lesson to what to avoid, or use that to try to fill in gaps in what we did, in the time prior to that. But if it's difficult if enough people aren't responsive to truth and to facts and to verifiable information, if you can just say, hey, I just like this, or this is just what it is, and you don't have to prove it for people to get on board, then it's difficult actually to move our kind of this big, cruise ship, or not, this big cruise ship that we're trying to turn here and turn there. It's difficult to turn it or move it in any direction, because people aren't all operating on the same idea of, hey, if something is true and verifiable, we can act on it. And if something isn't true and verifiable, we still are going to argue about it. And it's like, well, geez, if we tried to steer a cruise ship like that and say, hey, yeah, there's a storm over there, we can look and see it. And other people saying, no, there's no storm there. What you see there is just AI. Then, yeah, it would be difficult to convince the captain to say, hey, maybe we should steer away from the storm.
But it's even deeper than that. It's the passengers on the ship debating whether there's a storm or not on the horizon, whether they can see it or not, based on who's the captain of the ship. Because, it's interesting in this last few years when we've had inflation really in America for the first time since, let's say, the 70s. Because I remember, because I'm old enough now to have, watched this politics stuff for a couple of decades. And do you remember during the Bush administration, when they were starting to rack up these deficits, I remember the off-the-book spending, he would go down to the Capitol and ask Congress for $50 billion off the books. Remember that? And it just was adding up and racking up. And the excuse that I heard from people like Dick Cheney and others in that administration was, well, don't, and people that sympathized with them was, well, don't worry, we'll inflate ourselves out of that debt. Remember that?
Yeah.
And I remember thinking when then Obama got in, and for 8 years, all we heard about from that same crowd was, oh, deficit spending, which partially was the politics of they had a black guy in office and they want to tell certain people in this country that black people are bad with money, right? I mean, it just comes down to those natural kind of fault lines that we have culturally in our country.
Well, and it's not hard to for some people, it's not hard to convince them of that. In the same way
Correct.
that, Donald Trump, the borrowingest president over 4 years ever, is seen as good on the economy and good. And it's
that's
like,
my point. And that's my point.
Yeah.
So it's like that's what I mean. We've lived now, just you and I being in our 40s, long enough to see the same actions by different captains of the ship be responded to differently over time. So, because I thought
responded to, though, it's a good point. Not just responded to, be actually viewed as something when this person does it, it's a good thing, and when this person does it, it's a bad thing, or when this person does something worse. It's depending on who's doing it. That's where people line up, and that's definitely going to be
and that's why I wanted to bring it up. Is I remember when we started having high inflation in 21 to 22. I mean, that was one of the first things that came to my mind. I was like, hold on, these same people on Fox and CNBC and Bloomberg that are all complaining about all the debt, they were saying the way out of it's inflation. So shouldn't this be seen as part of a silver lining of inflation? I mean, I'm not trying to say inflation's great, but I'm just making the point that it's in a democracy, it does come back to us, the voters, that we have people that want to keep following, like you said, politicians and leaders in our country that we have seen now in power, whether they're in the Senate or Congress, whatever, long enough to see them say different things when different people behave the exact same way. And I think that's why it was harder to land the deficit stuff on Biden when he got in, because you're right. After beating up Obama for 8 years, and then Trump ran up more debt in 4 years than the prior 45 presidents or 44 presidents prior to him combined, it was hard to go make that argument about Joe Biden.
Over a 4-year period, in the 4-year period, he blew everybody away. Yeah.
But he's better with the economy, like you say, that people just believe this stuff.
Yeah.
Even though none of the stats bear it out.
Part of the reason they think that is probably because he borrowed so much money. It's like, hey, free money, everybody. So, and that's the incentive structure that we have to be aware of and be aware of, because it's like we are incentivizing our politicians, ones that will prioritize the short term. We're incentivizing them to try to make things as easy as possible in the short term and let everything else, fall by the wayside. I mean, Dick Cheney said we can inflate our way away. He wasn't saying that it would happen while he was in power, while it was on his watch. He's saying you guys in the future can inflate your way out of it, and you guys can feel the pain, and you'll forget about the fact that that I was the one that set this up, back then. So. But no, I mean, it's one of those situations, though, where, again, I'm glad you brought it back there. It does come down to us, the voters. We need to pay attention to what people say and pay attention, more importantly, what people do, because that is ultimately what we have to judge people on. And we cannot forget about the lessons of the past. And when serious people like Jamie Dimon speak up, we should pay attention. And we need to look at this and say, okay, how can we set up a system that's a little more sustainable? Because that's ultimately what Dimon is talking about. And my point, and I know you've helped make the point as well, like the answers we don't have to invent something completely new. Like people before us had solutions for stuff like this, but they also had the discipline and the will to kind of put those in place. And so that's going to be
one last thing that I learned, which is I want to share. It's kind of depressing in the 1980s under Reagan. And I like Reagan. I think he was a great orator. You go back and look at his speeches about immigration, things like that. It's so eloquent. So it's not about bashing Reagan, but the facts are the facts on the financial side. We went from the world's largest creditor nation to the world's largest debtor nation from 1981 to 1989. Yeah. And I just think it's hard to imagine us as the largest creditor in the world today. Like
you talked about it was a seminal change. You cut the top tax rate in half. Like he doubled the Social Security tax, largest middle class tax increase in history. He did a lot of things that
that was sobering when I read that. I was like, dang, man, that's
yeah.
I like you, dude, but that's just staying on the legacy.
Well, I mean, I think that I wasn't as big of a fan of Reagan, but I mean, I do think that what he did that was very good as far as was getting people to feel good about their country. I mean, I think that's important. Like, I think a lot of times some people don't recognize that. Like, there's the job of the day-to-day management, but there's also the job of the making people feel good about the thing that we're doing here. And so I think that's something that he was really good at, and I think is very important. And ideally, we get people that can do both, like that can manage it and keep us on a good track, but then also make us feel good about the American experiment, and not just feel good about isolated things or things that divide us, but make us feel good about things that unite us. So. But I think we could wrap this topic from here. We appreciate everybody for joining us on topic 1. Join us for topic 2 as well, and we'll see you then.